evening and welcome to the New York Society Library. I'm Sarah Holliday, the head of events, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the last of 3 important discussions about the intersections of art and activism in the time we're in now, the Anthropocene age. If you missed the first 2 panels, or if you'd like to relive them, recordings are available on the library's website. You can ask me or any library staffer for a pointer if you need one. A couple of points of business. We were fully registered for this, but as you see, other people who are less dedicated than you have moved on to the park or somewhere else and not come here. If anybody would like to move forward, including to the reserved seats in the front, you're welcome to. We trust you can see and hear from the back as well, so up to you. Please do silence cell phones or anything that might disrupt the presentation. We appreciate it. We are broadcasting this evening on Facebook Live, and the presentation and question and answer period are also being recorded, so please do take that into account. Books are available for sale by our colleagues from the corner bookstore just outside this door, and the authors of them will be glad to sign copies following the presentation. As you hopefully discovered already, we also have wine and snacks in the back of the room, and you're welcome to stay a bit after the presentation and discuss what you hear tonight. A few words about our panelists. Nathan Kensinger is a photographer, filmmaker, artist, and journalist based in Brooklyn. His work explores hidden urban landscapes, post-industrial ruins, environmental disaster zones, and sea level rise. For the past decade, he has been documenting New York City's changing waterfront in an ongoing series of photo essays featured by the New York Times and PBS NewsHour, and his most recent documentary film portrays the city's first managed retreat from rising sea levels. His photographs have been exhibited by the Museum of the City of New York, the Brooklyn Museum, and the Queens Museum. Nathan's installations related to New York's Superfund sites have been featured in the New Yorker, Wired, and the Wall Street Journal. He is currently the curator of Chance Ecologies, a public art project that explores the importance of wild species living in abandoned post-industrial landscapes. An assistant professor at Brooklyn College, Helen Phillips, is the author of 4 books, including most recently the short story collection Some Possible Solutions, winner of the 2017 John Gardner Fiction Book Award. Her novel, The Beautiful Bureaucrat, a New York Times Notable Book of 2015, was a finalist for the New York Public Library's Young Lions Award and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. She's the recipient of a Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award and the Italo Calvino Prize, among others. Her work has appeared in The Atlantic, The New York Times, and Tin House, and on selected shorts. Amitav Ghosh is an award-winning novelist and essayist whose books include The Circle of Reason, The Shadow Lines, In an Antique Land, Dancing in Cambodia, The Calcutta Chromosome, The Glass Palace, The Hungry Tide, and the Ibis Trilogy, Sea of Poppies, River of Smoke, and Flood of Fire. It's a pleasure just to say all of that. His work has been translated into more than 30 languages, and his essays have been published in The New Yorker, The New Republic, and The New York Times. In January 2007, he was awarded the Padma Shri, one of India's highest honors, by the President of India. And in 2017, he was awarded the inaugural Utah Award in the Environmental Humanities from the University of Utah. His most recent work of nonfiction, The Great Derangement, which is on sale outside the store, questions whether literature is doing enough to imagine the effects of climate change. Amy Brady is the deputy publisher of Guernica magazine and the senior editor of the Chicago Review of Books, where she writes about art, culture, and the environment. She'll be moderating this evening. Enjoy the presentation.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Great, good. Thank you everyone for being here this evening. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Amy Brady and I am the deputy publisher at Guernica magazine. For those of you who aren't familiar with Guernica, we are an online magazine that has been publishing since 2004, largely at the intersection of global arts and politics. To my mind, we have published some of the finest writers working today. In fact, our most recent issue focused specifically on the topic of deserts, just dropped this week, and I highly recommend you check it out. It's very, very impressive. We also publish a lot of up-and-coming writers who are very talented, and after publishing with us, go on to even greater things. So it is such a pleasure and an honor to be a part of that organization. But as a nonprofit magazine, we are run entirely by volunteers. And so what that means is that we rely on the support of our readers and other folks who are like-minded and appreciate the kind of work that we're doing. So to that end, if any of you would like to know more about Guernica or about how you can support our mission, please don't hesitate to come speak with me after the panel this evening. I would be more than happy to do so. That said, I think a few thank yous are in order. First, I want to thank the New York Society Library for having us this evening and for all 3 panels. Tonight is the capstone of a series on the topic of art and activism in the Anthropocene, and it has been just such a wonderful partnership and such a pleasure to be sitting in this gorgeous room night after night. So thank you, New York Society Library. Also, I want to thank Orion Magazine for supporting this project. Obviously, I want to thank all of you for being here. You guys are the reason why we do this. We want more public conversations about this topic. And then, of course, last and certainly not least, I want to thank our illustrious panel for being here this evening. What a great lineup. We are certainly going out on a high note this evening. So thank you, everyone, for being here. So let's jump right in. And to get us started tonight, I want to ask the same question of all 3 of you that I have been asking of all of our participants in all of our previous panels in this series. And that is, to help us to understand a little bit more about where you're coming from, what is it that first drew you to the topic of climate change? And what compels you to address it in your work? Nathan, can we start with you?
Sure. Hello. Can you hear me? Yeah. Excellent. So yeah, I'm Nathan Kensinger, and I guess what first drew me to climate change, I would have to say that's probably Hurricane Sandy. That was a big turning point in my own work documenting New York City. Up until Hurricane Sandy happened, I've been photographing and writing about and making films about all these neighborhoods around the waterfront of New York City. You know, kind of telling their histories, looking at how they were changing, looking at, you know, the various stories of these places that were not being written about very often. And when Hurricane Sandy happened, all of these communities that I'd spent about 5 years documenting were greatly impacted. Some of them were completely destroyed or swept away even by Hurricane Sandy. And that was just, I would say, a huge wake-up call for myself, but also for a lot of people in New York City who look at the waterfront. So I found myself in the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Sandy going back to these same places that I'd been photographing and looking at for years, and trying to tell their stories again, but through the lens of sea level rise, climate change, increased storms happening. So in the, really, you know, just in the days right after Hurricane Sandy, I began to document some of these places, to go down to these communities, and to try and show what had happened in the storm itself. And then in the past 5 or 6 years since Hurricane Sandy, I've repeatedly gone back and have been trying to, you know, trace that story out and show what sea level rise is going to mean for New York City, what's going to happen to all of these people living on the waterfront, and kind of seeing how it's all playing out. I mean, really, within New York City, there's so many fascinating stories of climate change that you can see playing out right now. You can see neighborhoods that flood every time there's a high tide. You can see neighborhoods where people have decided to give up and no longer live near the ocean and have moved inland and moved away and given up on their entire neighborhoods. And those are some of the stories that I've been looking at since Hurricane Sandy.
We were told that holding them in our hands is the way to do it. Okay. Thank you, Amy, for having us, and to the New York Society Library, and to all of you. Is this working? Yeah. Yes. I reconnected it properly. Okay. So for me, the answer to that question of how I became interested in dealing with climate and the environment in my fiction, I think springs from the fact that I grew up in a really rural place. I grew up in the mountains outside of Denver. So you could leave my child at home and wander hill and vale for hours and not see other people. And I have spent my entire adult life in an urban environment, in East Coast urban environments. And I love New York City. I love New York City profoundly. But living in a place like this and now raising my own young children in a place like this causes me to think a lot about how your relationship to the natural world shifts when you live in an urban place versus a rural place. So that's sort of, for me personally, that's been an interesting journey to kind of figure out how you do connect with nature when you're living in an urban place, and more people live in urban places. And as I think of what the future of the world will look like, I feel like this question, and actually I did a deep dive into Nathan's photography and films before the panel, and I feel like he was actually offering some interesting possibilities for what relationships to the natural world look like in urban environments. But I think about that a lot, especially raising my children in such a different environment from the one I grew up in. And at the same time that this has been the movement in my own life, of course the crisis of climate change has begun to feel ever more acute, ever more present in our daily lives with these terrible storms and just the daily realities that we're confronting. And so it seems I couldn't even not write about it. I mean, I always think of my writing as a way that I process my anxieties, and I would place this not top, I mean there are some serious contenders, but high up among the anxieties that I feel moved to process in my writing.
Thank you very much, Amy, for having us, and thank you to the library for having us, and thank you all for being here. My interest in climate change really began around about the year 2000 when I started working on a book called The Hungry Tide. I'm actually from Bengal, which is the delta of the Ganges and the Brahmaputra. And it's this, it's not a particularly big area. It's about the size of Kansas or something, but it's very densely populated. There are about 250 million people living there. And it's also very low-lying. So it's perhaps the most threatened part of the world. Climate change is going to displace tens of millions of people from there. Already is displacing many, many millions. So my book, The Hungry Tide, is set in a mangrove forest. And it's a forest that I've had a connection with for a very long time because I had uncles who lived there and so on. But when I went back in 2000 to spend time in this forest, it became very apparent to me that something was happening which was completely out of the ordinary. I mean, you could see that, that the sea had made inroads into places where it had never entered before. You could see that, I mean, the composition of the water was changing, but that's because of other impacts. So, you know, it was very clear right then that something very strange was happening in this landscape. And then in 2009, about 5 years after I finished my book, there was a, this is a very cyclone-prone region. In fact, the whole sort of, Bengal has had some of the most devastating cyclones of all time. The biggest natural disaster of the 20th century was a cyclone of 1970. It's called the Bhola cyclone. It hit Bangladesh in November 1970, and over 500,000 people are thought to have died in this cyclone. And it triggered really, you know, the Bangladesh War of Independence and so on. But in 2009, there was another very major cyclone called Cyclone Aila. And that's, you know, now in India and in Bangladesh, there are good systems of warning. So, you know, the casualty toll was not very high. But, you know, this cyclone had an even more devastating impact, really, because the sea just reached so far inland and salt water reached so far inland that many areas that were previously cultivated now are not going to be cultivated for generations. So, you know, a lot of land is lost, a lot of livelihoods are lost. And when you go there now, you can see lots of people are moving, and moving in really terrible ways often. So, for someone from my part of the world, I think it's actually impossible if you're paying any attention to the world to ignore climate change. And then it began to really interest me because the strangest thing is that, in fact, if you go to my part of the world, if you go to India, if you go to Bengal or whatever, no one's paying attention. I mean, the novels are not about this. The writing is not about this. It's about other things.
The subtitle of tonight's panel is Imagining the Impossible, the roles of novels and art in understanding climate change. So with that in mind, Amitav, my next question is for you, because The Great Derangement was a foundational text for me and for thinking about this subject. And for those of you who have yet to read it, it is a remarkable work of nonfiction that combines cultural and literary criticism with philosophy, with politics, with a history of colonialism. And all of that is combined to broach the question of where are the novels and art that address climate change? So with that in mind, there are so many ways that we can approach that question. Indeed, you can write a whole book about it, as Amitav did. But for the sake of tonight's panel, my question is Amitav, can you expand a little bit for us on what you see as being some of the greatest difficulties that fiction writers are facing when they're trying to describe climate change in their narratives?
It's not that the novels aren't there. They are there. Jeff Vandermeer, many writers have, in fact, written about climate change. So it's not that the novels aren't there. They are. The problem is more, I would say, with the ecosystem of literature as such, because it's not only about how people write. It's also about how people read and how those books are received. Because the extraordinary thing is that even when very accomplished writers write about climate change, their books become completely marginalized. I think the most striking instance of this is Barbara Kingsolver's Flight Behavior, which I think is a wonderful book and perhaps really one of the great novels about climate change. But if you look, and Barbara Kingsolver, after all, she's an American institution. Her books are hugely respected and admired and rewarded with prizes and so on. But if you look at the reception of Flight Behavior, it's very striking. The reviews are all kind of fairly, casual and sort of, why has she chosen to write about this, of all things, And there you are, again, Jeff Vandermeer, he's a major writer, but Cora Heston Boyle and so on, I mean, they're major writers, but do you see their work so often in the, let's say, the New York Review of Books or in the New York Times Book Review? You really don't. So it's one very interesting thing that strikes me, is that Doris Lessing, for the last 15, 20 years of her life, all she wrote basically was science fiction of one sort or another. And I recently read this interesting essay on her work where the writer was saying that, Doris Lessing, the Nobel Prize Committee had been sort of bandying her name about for a long time. But when she started writing science fiction, they got very worried and said, no, this is not real writing. So then suddenly, she wrote this memoir. And they said, oh, thank God, now we can give her it's the most extraordinary. So actually the question, the reason why this question is interesting to me is because after all, say the Times Book Review, all these major reviews, they represent high seriousness. I mean, they represent, if you like, the sort of heights of our culture. They are deciding what is to be taken seriously by the culture. And when they decide that this is not important, what does it tell us about what we might call high bourgeois seriousness?
Thank you so much for that. Helen, you're a novelist, and so I would love to hear your voice in this conversation, especially since I've seen so often your work described as speculative fiction. Though I would say, as a big fan of your work, that I think it's very hard to categorize. I think it fits in so many different categories. I would love to know, what has kind of the reception been towards your work in terms of your descriptions of climate change, as a speculative writer, or if you want to look at it a different way, what do you think that speculative or science fiction or genre fiction can do that perhaps the so-called serious fiction can't do?
In terms of the reception of my work and it being marked as climate fiction, I think you're right. I will have reviews of a book that don't mention that aspect of it, even though it's present. It's the books of mine that have that as a major theme are my short story collection, And Yet They Were Happy, which is a series of stories that are all exactly 340 words. That was a challenge I set myself, but they have categories like the floods, the apocalypses, they evoke a lot of environmental crises. And then my book, Some Possible Solutions, it's a short story collection, but many of them are set in kind of dystopian realities. And it just doesn't come up in the reviews. I think your point is a really interesting one, even though there are other things you can talk about, and reviewers tend to talk about the other things. In terms of what I think speculative fiction can do, well, for one thing, we have an issue now where I feel like I write sort of futuristic fiction, but the world keeps catching up and it's not futuristic anymore, it's just reality. So I've always conceived of myself as this kind of out there speculative sci-fi, and then, look at the world around us. It's all sci-fi now. But I brought my favorite Ursula K. Le Guin quote about, I actually brought it to share with you guys because I think it's so helpful in terms of why speculative and science fiction is important to serve this purpose. So what she says is, to me, the important thing is not to offer any specific hope of betterment, but by offering an imagined but persuasive alternative reality to dislodge my mind, and so the reader's mind, from the lazy, timorous habit of thinking that the way we live now is the only way people can live. It is that inertia that allows the institutions of injustice to continue unquestioned. So the idea just that imagining alternate realities, whatever they may be, moves us out of our inertia. I think that also speculative fiction, it can make you think about, it forces you to think about the future, it forces you to think about possible futures and either aspire to them or be terrified of them. And terror is helpful.
Well, speaking of terror, Nathan. Well, let's move into the artistic nonfiction realm for a moment, because you are a photographer. You have taken some remarkable photos of some devastated places. Your series after Hurricane Sandy was especially moving for me personally in looking at them. I would say, though, that one of the things that all of your photos have in common, whether they're environmental disaster areas or post-industrial areas or regions that are at risk of sea level rise, is that they are all of landscapes that are in the midst of undergoing kind of a dramatic transition. And a lot of those transitions are happening because of human activity. But what strikes me, though, is that so rarely does a human being actually appear in your photographs. So I would just love to hear from you, as an artist, what can we learn about these man-made spaces when the people who created them are absent?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple of reasons that there are no people in many of my photographs. One of them is that the places I'm photographing are not accessible to other people often. I often photograph places that are not meant to be seen, or that are fenced off, or that are kind of hidden away. So Superfund sites, or brownfields, or abandoned industrial ruins that have been left on the waterfront. They're not things that were meant to really be seen. They're meant to be hidden, and they're also in the process of kind of vanishing. A lot of the landscapes that I photograph, I'm purposely seeking out, knowing that they're going to disappear, but they have these important stories. I did a whole series, I'm still shooting it, but I did a whole series on Brooklyn's industrial waterfront being demolished. And all of the sugar refineries and shipyards and powerhouses kind of being torn down just over the last decade. And as I kept shooting that, and I started thinking more and more about it, and then starting to focus on climate change, it kind of made me think more and more that what we're erasing by taking out our industrial heritage in New York City is kind of the very story of how we got to this place with climate change. We're destroying all the factories, destroying all the evidence, essentially, of this pollution that led to our current situation. And that's kind of been a really interesting shift in my thinking about what I've been documenting. Another reason that there aren't very few people in my photographs is I like to kind of project the viewer into those spaces and have them experience them as I guess, a first visitor, kind of having their own entry into these landscapes and not have it interpreted through another human's experience other than my own, me the camera person. But it's really meant to be like a very strong point of view for people to enter into these places and kind of, I guess, have their own response, their own stories come out of viewing the photographs and the films as well. And I guess the third one now is that I'm really focused on almost what I would call like a non-human aesthetic. I'm becoming much more interested in telling non-human stories, telling the stories of landscapes, the stories of rivers, the stories of forests, the stories of other species in New York City. And I think that that's something that's really missing from a lot of fiction, a lot of writing, a lot of art does not really address the point of view of the non-human. So, I mean, I was before this panel trying to think of books that wrote about, let's say, climate change from the point of view of another species, and couldn't really come up with too many. Only a few came to mind, but I think that would be something valuable to talk about, but also to think about. Is, you know, we're dealing with climate change, we're dealing with these radical changes on the planet, and it's not just humans that are being affected by this. I mean, we're in the middle of the 6th great extinction, we're killing everything on planet Earth. Where are the stories that present that point of view? Where are the stories that present the point of view of the other mammals, the other, the fish in the sea, the forests, the lakes, the rivers? I think that would be really interesting to see more of that in all art forms, in fiction, in photography, and all kinds of storytelling.
Thank you for bringing that up. The subject of or the question rather, of where are the stories about non-human beings or agents, where are they? It was something that came up in the last panel. I would love to just toss actually that question to our novelists. What do you guys think? Is there a particular challenge to writing about that viewpoint? Is it, I mean, you guys are brilliant novelists, so I don't want to say it's a failure of imagination, but why don't we have more stories from a non-human perspective?
Well, now I know what my next novel will be.
I look forward to it.
I can answer more. Go ahead.
Well, this sort of veering away from the non-human is actually, I would say, a phenomenon that's accelerated exactly as greenhouse gas emissions have accelerated. It's one of the curious things about it. Because if you think about the 19th century, after all, I mean, what is Moby Dick? It's about a non-human being, and that being has agency, it has wisdom, it has rage, and it's about species being hunted to extinction. In so many ways, I do think that, Melville saw things that really have become close to us, I mean, if someone were to write a book like Moby Dick now, it would be classified as a children's book or as a genre book. I mean, the only reason that it clings on as the great American classic is because it was written before it could be pushed away, into that sort of. So, to me, that really, I think it's this, again, to return to this idea of sort of the bourgeois seriousness, I mean, that is actually what is taking us over the edge, in the sense of it's that bourgeois seriousness that cannot reckon with the non-human.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned the idea that it would be a children's book. And even when you were asking that question, my mind went to that place of children's literature, because inanimate objects and animals having agency is something that children are really open to, or that we associate with children. So it was actually funny, I didn't mention before, but my book that most directly deals with the climate is a book I wrote for middle grade readers, for 10 to 12-year-olds, that's about a bird that's going extinct, and it's all about the children's father is an ornithologist who's been kidnapped by this evil spa where they're grinding up the, sorry, spoiler alert, they're grinding, you guys don't need to read it, they're grinding up the bird's bones to make this anti-aging stuff. So I did take that on, but it's interesting that it was for an audience of children, and I don't know, maybe there is something about the sort of charm of giving agency to animals and natural environments that puts us in the direction of children. But we're all children. There should be more books for adults that are like that too. Yeah.
The last book of that kind that was taken seriously as adult literature that I can remember was Richard Adams's Watership Down, and that was a wonderful novel.
That was, yeah, all the ideas, I mean, all the examples that came to mind for me as well were books, I guess, that would be classified as children's literature. But Watership Down and also The Plague Dogs, which he also wrote, I don't think those are necessarily for children. I mean, I read them as a child and I was definitely scarred by them. And you can read them as an adult and they're still scarred. But yeah, most of the examples that I could think of really were, I guess, intended for pretty young readers, like The Rats of Nim. I mean, I remember reading a lot of these when I was a child, actually, and being fascinated by them, really loving these books that, the main characters were like mice, fighting in an abbey, like Redwall was a great one when I was a kid. And I don't see that as an adult. I don't really see, it's very rare that I would say that I see examples of that in literature and in other forms of art as well.
But what is actually interesting about our culture at this moment, that at any given moment, you look at the bestsellers, you look at the highest grossing films, they're all about non-human beings. They're about zombies, they're about vampires, they're about extraterrestrials. So, what that really tells us in some sense, I mean, actually when you look at the whole ecosystem of fiction, as I was saying, the readership of high serious fiction has almost disappeared. I mean, that's the strange thing. The culture has left it behind. The culture has actually embraced fiction about these non-human beings. And why is that? It's because, when you come back to it, it's because these non-human beings actually have real presence. It's in this way that they assert themselves.
To continue following this idea that a lot of the literature that takes this on as a concern, that's looking at other sorts of beings, is aimed at children. I'm thinking of the Disney movie Moana. I don't know if any of you have been exposed to that, but that is really about climate change in a really direct way. And it's kind of, I mean, a lot of parents, of course, have been forced to watch that 15 million times, but it's aimed at children. And I wonder why it is maybe that we create space in the culture to teach children about this concern, to educate them about that, to make them think about the perspective of animals and plants, and yet we don't create that for adults. I don't have any answer, but it's just an observation.
Yeah, I mean, another example that comes to mind from that world, I mean, I would say one of the greatest climate change films or films about environmental pollution that I've seen is Wall-E. And
Love
it's like it's theoretically a children's film, but I saw it as an adult, and I was like, this has some profound messages in it, but it's being aimed at children, and that's pretty fascinating to think, you know, that's the intended audience, maybe the intended audience. But yeah, where are the films like that aimed at adults? I don't know. I guess yeah, the zombie genre is huge now. That's definitely. I mean, I wonder why the most popular films, the most popular books now are zombie narratives or The Hunger Games. These are the films that are capturing so many millions of people. And I think about that. I wonder why that is. You know.
I think it also has to be said that, you know, film and television has been much more open to these possibilities than literature has. You know, I mean, if you think, there have been so many films, really, that grapple with climate change in a way that really serious fiction really doesn't. And maybe it's something to do with the medium of words itself.
I'm so glad that you brought up the film Wall-E, because it is a profound film, as you said. But I remember that when it first came out, there was a kind of a certain sector of the population that criticized it for taking a kind of political message, or what they deemed as political. And I bring that up because a theme that seems to come up in all of these conversations, and indeed, it was a part of a conversation we were having upstairs before we came down, which is art still art when it becomes politically charged or didactic? At some point, according to some people, it becomes propaganda. So I would love to hear from all three of you, in terms of your own medium or an art that you admire. Is it possible to make great art that is also politically charged? And I would just add to that that, you know, in the United States at least, the issue of climate change is politically charged.
I mean, it's a difficult line to walk. Speaking now as an artist, not necessarily just as a photographer. I do photography, film, and installation art, and many different kinds of art, and I also curate all kinds of different artists. It's a difficult line to walk where you, as an artist, don't necessarily want to step too far in one direction and, I guess you'd say, almost be pigeonholed in a way, or have your artwork fall into a category that captures it. And maybe that's something you're talking about here too with fiction. Like, you don't, I think there's a lot of fear that if the fiction veers to a certain direction, it's going to be only looked at through one lens. And that lens would be, you know, well, if it's about climate change, you know, it has an opinion that, you know, some people might not agree with, some people might not believe in climate change, or might disagree with the point of views you have on climate change. And so I do see that it is a challenge to kind of make artwork that can address climate change, can address these really serious topics, while also not alienating a huge percentage of your viewers or your people who might want to participate with your artwork, and also not kind of having your work slip into this box where it can be really easily dismissed.
Yeah, I'd say for me there's a big difference between something being didactic and something being ethically engaged. And so to me what ethically engaged fiction would be is fiction that does an excellent job at illuminating just gray areas and complexity. And I mean, we can, I guess, agree or disagree on climate change, but really what the ramifications are, or how you deal with it, or, I mean, there's a lot of things that nobody has an answer to. So it would, yeah, I mean, it would be hard to even be didactic about precisely what we need to do, because even the best scientists don't know. So to me, it has to do with really just trying to get at the complexity of human experience in all of its shades, no matter what it is that you're writing about. But I was saying upstairs that I'm teaching a graduate class now about experiments in fiction, and I feel like I was raised educated in a way to believe that art can't be didactic, that art can't be political. If it's political, it's not art, it's something else. And with my graduate students I'm working with now, we've been really talking about that assumption and the fact that it doesn't feel true anymore. It feels like art isn't just this separate aesthetic realm, that any art has political implications whether you want it to or not. We're in a moment that feels like you can't just say art can't be ethical or it's just propaganda.
Well, I was raised in a different sort of literary culture where it was assumed that writing and politics are not separate. But I have to say that even when you look at Western writing for the last 30 years, I don't see how anyone could imagine that it was not political, because look at it, I mean, feminist writing, gay writing, identity writing of various sorts, or writing about military experiences. I mean, all of it is just politics is at the heart of it, And I think actually that's one of the reasons why climate change is so elusive to art, to novelistic technique as it's evolved, because all of these issues are joined by one thing, which is that they're all about identity. And somehow it's very hard to address climate through an identity prism. And I think that's why it so resists contemporary fiction, because artists, writers have become very accustomed to thinking about their work in terms of identitarian issues. And it's very hard to frame this in that way.
Amitav, your voice in this conversation is so important for so many reasons. But one reason why I'm so excited that you are here tonight is because in your fiction and in your nonfiction, you take a global view of climate change. And I hate to say it, but I think it's very true that Americans are kind of renowned around the world for being kind of national navel gazers. We don't think too often outside of our own boundaries. A question I would like just to ask you is, what would Americans in general, but perhaps our writers as well, what would we gain if we looked at climate change from a more global perspective?
Well, it certainly does strike me very often that when I'm with sort of climate-interested people in America, the whole discourse on climate is the most Eurocentric discourse that exists. It's really quite striking because I suppose because so much of this discourse is produced by Western universities and so on, somehow it's an incredibly Eurocentric discourse. And to this day, I think somehow when we talk about this, people say, what can we do? Meaning, what can we Americans do? And the thing is really that America is not the main player in this. This issue is not going to be settled in America. It's going to be settled in Asia. That is where these issues are going to be settled. If this problem was ever purely a Western problem or whatever, that door has long since closed. So if there is a solution, that solution can never exist unless Asians are brought on board.
I would say that was a fascinating section in your book, The Great Derangement, and people should read that book because it really hashes that out, brings that argument out in a fantastic way. I think it really made me think quite a great deal about that. Thank you.
Yes, seconded. Nathan, I want to talk about your work here for just a moment. What if you had an ideal viewer, what would you hope that person took away from your photographs?
That's a difficult question. I would say with my photographs and with a lot of the other artworks that I do, it's intended to be engaged at multiple levels. I'm kind of thinking of this art installation I did on the Newtown Creek, which is a creek in New York City, which is a Superfund site. It's one of the most polluted bodies of water in the United States. And actually, with my wife who's in the audience, Sarah, and a third artist, Laura Chipley, we created an installation on the Newtown Creek with the intent to bring people there to experience the site, to appreciate the history of the site. And in thinking about that, we really had to walk through like the different levels that someone could come to that place and experience it. And I think that's true of my photographs as well, but it's like you can look on one level and have a very quick response to the projects that I make. You can look at the photographs and say, oh, this is an interesting place. You know, this is an interesting space to look at. You can dig a little deeper. All of the photographs are put into the context of photo essays, where I write extensively kind of about the places that I am photographing. You could dig deeper into those levels where you have an experience of learning more about the background and the history of the place. And I would say really the ideal would be that people would have like a much higher level of engagement with these things and not just look at the works, you know, perfunctorily and quickly, or not just even read into what I'm saying, but have their own kind of, their own deeper response, their own ideas come out of it, where they go off on their own and sort of investigate these issues that I'm trying to raise in their own lives. So really having like a viewer who is open to responding to the artwork and then have it in some way impact their lives and transform it. Our installation on the Newtown Creek was called the Newtown Creek Armada. We built a model boat pond on the Newtown Creek, designed after the Central Park boat pond. And we invited people to come and experience this Superfund site, this polluted body of water, through the lens of sort of playful engagement, where you would pilot these boats around on the waterway and make your own film. All the boats had a camera on them. So people were actually documenting the pollution in the creek with these waterproof cameras. So some people came and brought their kids and had a picnic on the banks of this polluted creek, and it was a fun day out. Some people came and had a deeper experience where they really dug into like the various layers of information that we were also providing of the history of the creek. And for some people, I've heard from some people that it sort of changed their not their lives, but their experience of that particular waterway. People joined the canoe club that operates on this creek and became like tour guides who would go out and lead their own kind of voyages along the waterways of New York City. And that would be the ideal for me. I mean, if you can like change someone's life through your writing or through your photography or through your artworks, that's, you know, I think that would be the ultimate ideal.
I have sort of a follow-up question to that as a viewer of your art. A question arose for me as I was looking at your photographs and watching your videos. Well, they're very beautiful. Your photographs are very beautiful, and your videos are very meditative and peaceful, and they reinvent these urban spaces in this kind of like tranquil, rustic way almost. And so part of me just enjoyed that aesthetic quality of them, and then part of me wondered, what is the effect if you're taking something that we usually think of as being an ugly or disturbing thing, and you take this amazing photograph of it and suddenly it's beautiful? Are you suggesting sort of a path forward into a future where we just have to live with these sort of decaying urban spaces and rising oceans, and we find beauty in that? I was wondering what it means to you that your art is so beautiful.
That's a great question. I guess beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Some of these places, they are deceptively very, very beautiful spaces, and yet you're looking at horrible pollution. I have a photograph that I love that's of this landfill on Jamaica Bay in Queens. It's been breached, and the landfill has spilled out like thousands of bottles onto the beach. And you're walking on this beach that's made up of just debris. I mean, you know, pure pollution falling into the water, polluting the water. But it is a strangely beautiful place. I mean, you're walking on a beach made out of glass, out of the history of pollution that was buried and hidden away and has now revealed itself. And I think that an experience like that, it's hard to translate that experience, my personal experience of being there, into like a photograph, but that's sort of the attempt. Is I go to these places with an eye towards sharing these very strange experiences of pollution, of abandonment, of climate change, and trying to translate that into something that a viewer can have their own experience of it, whether they see beauty or whether they're horrified by it. I don't really know. Sometimes people are horrified. They look at the photos and they're like, oh man, this is terrible. It depends on the photograph.
And the viewer.
And the viewer, yeah.
I actually have a version of that question I would like to give to you, Helen, because one of the reasons why I love your work is that, you know, whether you're writing about environmental issues or the woman's body or otherworldly beings, there are some descriptions in your work that are truly beautiful, but many of them are also unsettling. I think a word that comes up often in reviews of your work is uncanny.
Mm-hmm.
So my question then is, so what draws you to this notion of the uncanny, and do you think it's useful in communicating issues of climate change?
Well, I don't know if I'm exactly drawn to the uncanny. I just move through the world finding almost everything uncanny. So I feel like almost anything you look at a little bit closely just starts to feel slightly strange. Like any word you repeat over and over, it becomes a non-word. So is that uncanniness serving a purpose? I would say that it's serving the purpose perhaps of, it's sort of, when I'm evoking something that's beautiful and eerie, in a way it's just that basic thing that I'm trying to do as a writer, which is to convey my own personal experience of the world, even if that means I might be describing an alien at that moment, or I might be describing what it's like to use a breast pump, which is a total sci-fi experience. You know, even something that comes from another world, I feel like what I'm trying to do is just reveal the sort of uncanniness that surrounds us. And actually, some of my most uncanny scenes are actually the most mundane scenes, like a table that's set and no one's sitting at the table, and it's just a description of the table and the food on the table. That was in my first book. I think that's one of the scariest things I've written, and nothing really happens, but you just go microscopic on it, and suddenly it becomes really strange. So I guess part of it is that I sort of look around and I wonder, are other people finding this all so uncanny as I am? Maybe if I write it down and someone else reads it and then they say, oh yeah, I feel that way too, then I won't feel alone in this like terrifying, uncanny space.
I think uncanny is exactly the ground of climate change.
I think we have time for one more question before I turn to the audience. So I will say that I created this panel tonight kind of under the assumption that art and novels do matter in the discussion of climate change, but I'm realizing here that we haven't actually discussed why that is. So my last question for all three of you is you know, why does art, or let's put it that way, why does art and novels matter in a time of climate change?
I'm not going to start on that one. I'll pass it down.
Oh, to me? Look, I think, it matters to me because I'm a novelist and that's all I've ever done. So I have to ask myself, to me, this book I wrote, The Great Derangement, it's really a kind of introspection about how it is that something, writers like myself, we started writing at a moment when the dominant sort of aesthetic was one of avant-gardism. We thought that, we as writers could see things that other people couldn't. And now it's become so clear that, in fact, exactly the opposite was the case. We were actually far from being in the avant-garde, we were actually lagging behind, what everybody else could see. And in a way, it was our work, our art, that prevented our seeing it. And that's what interests me, really.
I mean, that's a very hard question and makes me reflect on things like how many American adults have even read a novel in the past year. So putting that aside, and just imagining a dream world where everyone from our highest leader on down read fiction. I guess I feel like fiction can maybe do a couple of things right now. Like, one is we can hear statistics about global warming, but they're kind of abstract and scientific. And so I think that well-written climate fiction or speculative or futuristic fiction that, again, will quickly cease to be futuristic, can put your body in that place and can make you more nervous and scared and anxious about it. I mean, how does that actually convert to, like, rejoining the Paris Climate Accord or actual political action? I'm a little concerned about or dubious about. But I also think another possibility, and again this takes me back a little bit to Nathan's work, is imagining what life will look like when the oceans rise, what life will look like in a polluted world. How will we survive? Where will our children find beauty and peace? Yeah.
Yeah, that is a very difficult question. I would say the best art for me is something that can really change the way you look at the world. The best, films that really struck me the deepest, the ones that really changed the way that I look at the world around me. The photographers who really changed the way that I view the world are the ones that stick with me the most. So for me, I think the role of art in climate is that art can help make people look at the future, look at what's coming down the road with climate change in a way that they might not otherwise. If you just read a newspaper article every day that's like, horrible things are happening, it's a lot different than if you read a novel that sort of speculates about what those horrible things could be, or if you look at a painting that is like, this is a possible future that we may have. Or if you look at a photograph that helps tell that story, it's much different than facts, dry facts. I think a lot of people get overwhelmed by just hearing the same facts over and over, and also a lot of people, myself included, are overwhelmed by the science behind climate change. And that's something as well that I would say, artists can help translate those facts and that science into something that other people can understand. I tell scientists all the time, I've collaborated with engineers and scientists and a lot of different groups that are dealing with some pretty dry, boring facts about climate change and sea level rise and pollution, and I tell them repeatedly, artists can help you translate this into something that other people can appreciate, that other people can grasp. Because if you just show them a report, most people are going to be like, wow, this is too much. I'm not going to look at all these graphs and charts necessarily. I mean, imagine if your fiction was just all graphs and charts. That would just be so dull. No one would read that. But on the other hand, we haven't really talked about nonfiction. I would say for myself, nonfiction is often the catalyst for changing how I look at the world as well. And I'll give a shout out to The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Colbert. I mean, that book changed my life as well. After Hurricane Sandy, reading The Sixth Extinction, it was pretty life-changing path. And then after that, reading Cosmos by Carl Sagan, actually kind of brought me out of that negativity about the future of the world, because it gives you a perspective on a planet that's sort of shows how small the planet actually is, and how these issues that are affecting us aren't all that important in the cosmic sense. So in a way, that's reassuring. Our planet may be in the middle, we may be in the middle of a sixth extinction, and we may be about to flood all of our cities, but in the bigger sense, we're just a little speck of dust, and there's probably other life out there.
Well, on that hopeful note, I'd like to open up questions to the audience. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, in the back.
I was wondering if you could say more about how the cyclone triggered a war. I'm afraid of being worried about that wars.
Okay, back then, the country that is now Bangladesh was East Pakistan. And there had been a sort of recurrent, political trouble, sort of nationalism in Bangladesh and so on. But after this terrible cyclone, the Pakistani government didn't respond immediately, didn't respond very well. So that really triggered, as it were, the big uprising that then became the Bangladesh War of Independence.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, here in the middle.
So there's been a lot of discussion about the future in fiction and art, and I'm wondering, there's always so much happening right now with climate change, people being affected by climate change, who are dying, who have to relocate, their countries won't exist by mid-century. What is the challenge about writing something set in the present to flush those issues out for readers and viewers?
I'd say documentary film is doing a fairly decent job of capturing some of those really timely stories that are happening now. Capturing the effects of sea level rise as they're happening now, the effects of climate change as they're happening now. I think it would be difficult to, correct me if I'm wrong, but it might be hard to write a book about something that's happening immediately, because as soon as the book came out, it'd be kind of dated in a sense, but correct me if I'm wrong.
I think your question is a very, very good question, because actually, I think one of the really great works of American literature is a work about climate change, and it's The Grapes of Wrath. If you read the first chapter of Grapes of Wrath, it's a magnificent piece of writing on literally climate change, because, that whole migration out of the Midwest comes because of, the changes in the Dust Bowl. And it's exactly this. I mean, the book is about migrants, moving, having to move. It's just one small group of migrants. In a way, it's like Moby Dick. It's instead of a ship, you have a truck, and these people moving across. And it's such a powerful book. But, if you look back on the reception of Steinbeck is revered in Asia, and in many other parts of the world. He's not in America. And he was reviled by his contemporaries, absolutely reviled by Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald and so on. Whereas, that book, I think, was the most important book, American book of the 20th century. Now, why was that book so reviled? I think that tells us one of the reasons why we don't get that book, about a retreat. Because our contemporary ideology has become one of, if you like, a sort of blind belief that things will always get better, that there will always be more, that there'll be more of everything. And that's, I think that's what really holds back our writing of these books. Because if you even look at sort of a state of the moment novels, which are, often written, all of them really somehow sort of assume this thing that, there'll be more and more stuff. And now it's become perfectly clear that that is what there won't be. There won't be more stuff.
Thank you.
I just had a good example come to mind of someone who did write a book that was fairly timely, Odds Against Tomorrow by, it's Nathaniel Rich. Yeah, that was a fantastic novel that could have happened, at the same time as it came out around the same time as Hurricane Sandy. It's essentially about the same type of storm in a way, just much worse. And that's a great example of a novel addressing what is it going to be like when New York City is swept away in a giant storm in our current times. It does a fantastic job of exploring that idea in New York City. I know there's a lot of other examples outside of New York City, but
I think the point he was making, which I think is a very important point, is that this. I think a lot of our science fiction and writing about climate change has become obsessed with apocalypse, and that's a good example. What he's talking about is really the slow death, the slow death of John Steinbeck.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
This is a question for all three of you. I'm wondering if you have a success story, like if there was one time where you felt like your work had a very specific impact in relation to climate change, or changing, people's view or something like that.
Well, I don't know, maybe I'm making a very tall claim, but after my book, The Hungry Tide, came out, it certainly had some positive impacts. The government in India and in West Bengal. Certainly, it was a strange thing. This mangrove forest, the Sundarbans, it exists. It's a very amazing landscape, but there's never been any fiction about it. And as a result, it's never actually existed as a space in people's in the imaginary. And I do think that in some way my book did do that. It placed this place in the imaginary. And I think that's just about the most that a novelist can hope to do.
Yeah, I would agree that that's sort of the most that one can hope to do, but I dare not make the claim that my fiction has really affected anyone in this regard, or in any regard. But after I wrote my book for children, Here Where the Sunbeams Are Green, I got a lot of fan mail. It's great to get fan mail from 10-year-olds because they haven't read much, so they'll be like, your book is the best book ever written. And they've read a couple of books. So plenty of children said that to me, and I did get a lot of reactions from kids about the bird going extinct and that kind of thing. So again, maybe kids are where we seem to be directing these energies towards children.
I think if you wrote a book about the poor polar bear who's drowning, and the child mourning the parent, I mean, and you took the pictures. People would pay attention.
We just had the $1 million idea. Okay, you can take a cut.
Going back to that previous question, I guess it's hard for me to measure the impact that my work has necessarily, but I guess the intent of my work is really to change the discourse, at least here in New York City, by constantly reminding people about what happened after Hurricane Sandy, about rising sea levels, about the pollution that surrounds us, about these things that are already here. And I do think that discourse has changed somewhat. I mean, I feel like when I first started doing these photo essays about 11 years ago, I do a photo essay every 2 weeks about some aspect of New York City's waterfront. So for the last 11 years, every 2 weeks, I've written a different story about New York City's coast or neighborhoods. And when I started, people were not looking at the water. They were not looking at these neighborhoods. They were not looking at the natural world in New York City in the same way. And I'm not saying it was my work that created this shift, but there has been a shift now where there's so many people who are interested in the waterfront of New York City, who are interested in the natural world of New York City, the pollution that's affecting New York City, the story of what's going to happen in New York City in the future in the face of sea level rise especially is becoming increasingly more and more a topic that people are looking at. So it's hard for me to measure my impact on that, but certainly that's my goal, is to change that discourse, to have it be present so often that it starts to kind of seep into people's consciousness. I have an exhibit in the subway right now, actually, the Atlantic Avenue subway station, where I have about 8 photographs showing the pollution of Brooklyn's waterfront. And I don't know how many millions of people have seen that, and whether it's affected those millions of people in any particular way, but I do know that it's been up for almost 2 years now. It has to have seeped into these millions of people's consciousness as they have their daily commute, to have these images right there in their mind, as opposed to an ad for a cell phone. Image of Brooklyn's polluted waterfront is now burned into their daily experience for 2 years.
Do you have a gallery that represents you?
I'm not represented by a gallery now.
Where do we see photographs of yours besides the subway?
You can go to the subway. Yeah, I have a great website you can visit. The photo essays come out every 2 weeks on a website called Curved New York, and I have photos in the subway, photos in the Brooklyn Historical Society right now, which has a great exhibit about the waterfront of Brooklyn. Some of my photographs from Hurricane Sandy are in that, because of the exhibit addresses Hurricane Sandy and sea level rise in a really fantastic way.
And
Yeah, those are some of the places.
I'll second that the photo essays in Curb New York are astounding. I highly recommend you check them out. Everyone checks them out. Other questions? Is in the very back here, the gentleman. Yep.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear you guys talk about just all these different aspects of what art can do. And I just got back from like the climate talks this past week, and one of the parallels that I see is the humanizing quality and the shedding of like what is the technocratic, bureaucratic, bourgeois way to like look at climate change is this thing that is separate from us and we need to address it rather than it's something that impacts all of us. And so I just see a lot of similarities between how activism and art does that humanizing, does that addressing of the problem from a really direct place. And I guess my question is more around like how do we more like better catalyze the connection between activism and art and bring it into a better sphere of like cohesion?
That's a great question. One example that is coming up this weekend at the Queen's Museum is a conference called Open Engagement, which is artists who are addressing sustainability through their social practice. And I'll be giving a presentation at the Queen's Museum about a project I've been working on called Chance Ecologies. But it's essentially going to be a collection of artists from around the world who are coming together to talk about creating artwork to address social issues of all kinds, not just climate change, but a lot of them will be addressing climate change. So I'll report back after that. I think I'm going to be meeting a ton of people who are engaged with these issues. But I have a real challenge, like coming up with artists. You know, before this panel, I tried to think of artists who were doing a great job of addressing climate change, and I could not think of a lot. That's a question I guess I would have, you know, other artists besides novelists or writers. Yeah, what artists are really out there addressing climate change in a great way? I came up with a very short list.
I was just reading highlights for children with my kids last night, and do you know of this artist on the West Coast who gathers up all the litter that washes up on the beaches of Washington and makes them into fantastical sea creatures?
No, that sounds great.
Yeah, they're beautiful, they're amazing, and all these volunteers, they've collected like 200 tons of trash that's washing up on the shore. Your question is such an important and interesting one, and I love what you say, the idea that both activists and artists are trying to figure out a way to make these crises feel human and not abstract. In terms of specific kind of affiliations or what we can all do together, I'm gonna think about that. That's a really cool question, and I want to think more about sort of what a really concrete collaboration could look. What do you think? You must have some answer. No. Oh,
okay. You're right. Actually, what is really extraordinary is that today it's very hard to think of an artist who. It's the same issue that you have with novels. I mean, it's the ecosystem of art which actually completely sidelines. It even sidelines figurative art. It even sidelines representational art. Where is it at with art today? It's all conceptual art, or it's called political art, which is essentially sort of about identity issues. But today, most artists that you meet are not even able to draw a tree. And if they did, if they did, they would never be able to show it. They would be overwhelmed by shame. And art, which is considered representational, is considered, they use the word artisanal for art of that kind. So this is the extraordinary thing. You see that, if you look at Descartes, 500 years ago, saying, "I think, therefore I am," this is what art has become. But, human beings aren't what they think. They're also what they experience. They're what they look at. There's been nothing more destructive to this world than this Cartesian view of the world. And this is what our current art is stuck in this kind of conceptualism and this completely, to my mind, absolutely banal form of retreat into into what they think of as ideas.
Are you familiar with, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I don't know if people have seen the statue of the three rhinos in Leeds Village. Yeah. I wonder if that was that connected to activists, or was it just independent artists and no collaboration? But it seems like that might have come out of some kind of, at least a discussion.
Yeah. That's the sculpture of the three last, were they the white rhinos?
Yeah.
Or, three last white rhinos in the world. I forget who the artist was, but since it went up, I think one of those white rhinos is dead, and now the white rhinos are effectively extinct because the last male white rhino passed away. But yeah, that's a great example of a piece that really looks at species extinction, which is climate change as well, or maybe even the bigger problem. But yeah. But no, I wish there was more. I mean, actually, there's an exhibit at Storm King that I just read about that just opened. It's about to open. It's maybe like 6 or 8 artists all looking at climate change through sculptural works. And I haven't been up there yet to see it, but I'm looking forward to seeing that. Yeah. So there are more artists who are addressing these issues, certainly. But I can't think of, like, you know, if I had to name like great artists whose work has been dedicated to climate change. I can't think of too many. I mean, photographers, certainly. There's some photographers, Bertinsky and Sebastian Salgado. But painters, there's a couple painters that come to mind, but not a ton.
Well, at risk of sounding so self-serving, I just want to say that's why conversations like this are so important. You know, to bring more attention and awareness to the art in narrative and in visual forms that is being done. I think we have time for one more question from the audience. There was a hand back here. Yes.
Actually, I was just going to make a note. So I'm one of the artists in the Storm King show.
Oh, great.
And it should be a pretty good show. They did struggle, the curators did struggle to find artists that were really engaging in climate change related subject matter. So it's called Indicators Arts and Climate Change, and it opens next Saturday.
What is your name? Tell us.
I'm Justin, Guriglia. So
Everybody go see Justin's work at Storm King.
So there should be, Maya Lynn is also in the show. You guys probably know Maya's work. David Brooks is another one, Mark Dial.
I think Mary Magdalene. Yeah.
Artists there.
This is mostly outdoor.
Well, so there's a whole museum at Storm King. There's a big building, and the building's going to be filled with works, and then there's also works all spread out on the property. So, but it is, there are not many artists. There are a lot of more craftspeople who are approaching the subject matter of climate change, but there are not that many artists that are really deeply engaged in it. But that's changing. It's taking more time. Artists respond fairly slowly.
I think
as do we.
Yeah.
And going back to what we were talking about before about art and why art is so important. Right? Art concretizes our notion of kind of the natural world, right? And one of the things that you notice is that good art gives us a language. It gives us a structure from which we can really begin to understand all these things. And so I think that's why you were asking before, why is this so important now? I mean, artists and writers are giving us this language and giving people a language and a way to actually really kind of bridge this gap. There's an ontological gap, or just whatever the gap is that exists there between what we see, what we're perceiving, and what actually exists. And that's why your writing is so important, your filmmaking is so important, and artists are so important today. Because we're kind of the last defense, we're the last hope,
I actually saw a whole bunch of hands. Do we have time for just one more question? Because there was a bunch of hands that went up kind of at the last minute. Yes?
One of the things that struck me about your question was that you were saying that like art and activism tend to humanize the issue of climate change, and a lot of the time when people talk about the idea of humanizing, that's moving away from like the technical details of the problem, or it might be moving away from the abstract concepts or the science that actually define the problem in the first place. So I'm interested in if any of you want to talk about this dichotomy between the humanizing of a problem and the the concrete science or the evidence of that problem, whether there's a way to bridge that gap, how you see working with scientists as important or not important.
I mean, as I said before, I think it's definitely very important for artists and scientists to collaborate, especially around the issue of climate change, because, as you said as well, it is such a complicated issue. There's so much information and so much that you have to process to even kind of come to an understanding of it, and being able to translate that into something that other people can understand. I mean, it really is. I don't know who else besides artists would take that on. Artists meaning writers, writers of fiction and nonfiction, artists meaning filmmakers, artists including even journalists in some cases. Journalists actually are considered to be artists in some sense, so that they really do a fantastic job of translating these stories into other forms that people can understand. Creative nonfiction or just straightforward journalism can really do a fantastic job of helping explain what's happening over here with these almost siloed scientists and engineers and people, building coastal defenses. Like, how do you share that story? I do think artists are kind of the conduit.
Many of my ideas for my stories and books come from science articles. So often I read science articles and it just is the nugget that leads. I have one story in my collection that is about the decline of the bee colonies. That was a science. I'm just always reading science articles and pasting them into my things to think about as I'm working on my next project. And for my last book, I interviewed in depth a mathematician, and for this book, I interviewed a paleobotanist. I love scientists. I think they're the most interesting people. I feel like they're similar to artists. I feel very connected to them. I mean, I feel like they're geniuses compared to me, but I love talking to them and learning from them, be it by reading an article or actually speaking with them. So, yeah, I think the idea that part of what art can do is kind of translate ideas from science. I haven't articulated it that way before, but when I think of my creative process, that's a lot of what it is really diving deep with a scientific topic and then taking it to an absurd extreme.
In relation to the earlier thing where we were talking about art, there is Mary Mount, I think is the name. Mary Miss, who's been doing very interesting work on these issues, especially in relation to architecture for a very long time. I feel that one must mention her.
Thank you for doing that. Well, I think that is all the time we have for this evening. So Nathan, Helen, Amitav, thank you so very much for being here this evening. It has been such a pleasure. Before all of you leave this room this evening, I just want to remind you again that both Amitav and Helen's books are for sale in the lobby. And my guess is that they would be willing to sign a copy if you would like them to do so. So please feel free to come up after purchasing a copy. And thank you again for being here.